Okay, so this lecture is going to focus on the radicals and how significant a threat they were, really. Now, the radical reformers acted before the First Great Reform Act of 1832. Their period of dominance was predominantly between 1790 and 1830. So we've got our four radical reformers: Thomas Paine, John Cartwright, William Cobbett, and Henry Hunt. Starting with Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine advocated for the French Revolution in response to the initial Rights of Man published by Edmund Burke. He justified philosophically the idea of equal rights for all men, put forward radical ideas calling for the abolition of the monarchy and the lords, and published Rights of Man Parts 1 and 2. And this book argued all of his ideas. It promoted equal rights, it promoted revolution to remove the monarchy and remove the government, and it was incredibly popular. He sold 200,000 copies of Part 1 in comparison to Burke's book, which only sold 30,000 copies. The government thought he was a threat as they tried to arrest him and suppress the publication of Part 2. So we can see that he was deemed a considerable threat as the government decided they needed to action him and therefore arrested him and tried to stop his publication. He had a huge influence in America and France. And when he was arrested, he was then forced to leave Britain, and the publication of Part 2, Rights of Man, was initially delayed. So whilst initially he had quite a lot of influence, we can see this through the 200,000 copies of Part 1, his influence then started to diminish within Britain due to the fact that he was arrested and then forced to leave, and the fact that Part 2 was delayed. Then we move on to John Cartwright. Now, John Cartwright was around between 1740 and 1824. He created this thing called the Hampden Clubs in 1812, which then expanded in 1816. He wanted to create a national strategy which petitioned to Parliament and had clear aims of universal suffrage and annual Parliament. Now, the Hampden Clubs obviously lasted for a few years, and this idea of national organisation shows that he was relatively significant, because for the first time, instead of just working in London, his aim was to create a national union, a national organisation, which would present a united front to the government. And he targeted the working class. Okay, so he's targeting the people who, at this moment, do not have suffrage. He filled the gap which was left by the London Corresponding Society and the collapse of that. Initially, it was quite an exclusive club, and it was then became regional in 1816. However, the clubs were spied upon, so the government had a spy system which infiltrated the Hampden Clubs, which then led to the arrest of several members. Because of this, the Hampden Clubs essentially came to an end and were unable to act effectively after 1817. So whilst John Cartwright was able to create a national organisation, he was able to gain the support of the working class, ultimately his actions came to an end due to the role of the government and the collapse of the Hampden Clubs. But what is significant is the fact that he petitioned for universal suffrage and introduced this idea of petitioning to the people. We then have William Cobbett. Now, William Cobbett created this thing called the Political Register, which cost 1 shilling, and it became the leading source of independent news. He stood for an MP in 1806, but was unsuccessful, and became more inspired to then promote radical ideas as a result of this. He published articles about the inhumane and cruel punishments issued by the government, in order to try and get people to see the pitfalls of the government and support his movement for greater franchise for the working class. Now, the government had issued a high newspaper tax, so his Political Register became more expensive in order to create profit, and then became inaccessible to the working class. To overcome this, he created a single sheet of the register which cost 2 pence, therefore making it more accessible for the working class. So he made it more accessible, which then led to its circulation of 4,000 people to the Political Register. So that's quite a significant number of people at the time. By the end of 1817, 200,000 copies of the Register had been printed and circulated throughout Britain. So we can see a significant number of people were exposed to his ideas and exposed to his articles and thoughts, thus showing a relative amount of significance. He was also able to overcome the sort of restrictions placed by the government with the high newspaper tax and still promote universal suffrage. However, whilst he acted to promote suffrage, his petition to become MP was overall unsuccessful. And ultimately, to try and create change within Parliament, at the time, people were more successful if they were voted as MPs. He was then also tried for seditious libel against the government and jailed for 2 years. So, in his active period, between, in the sort of 1817 era, he was able to create some following. He was able to create some change and increase the spread of radical ideas. However, he was then jailed for 2 years, which meant that his significance declined, and ultimately his threat towards the government was eliminated. We then have Henry Hunt. Now, Henry Hunt was our orator, and he was around between 1773 and 1835. He was a radical journalist. He had quite a wide following, and he used his oratory powers to address people in meetings throughout the country. He, like William Cobbett, had wanted to become MP, but was unsuccessful in his bid to become elected as MP in Bristol in 1812. He then moved to London following his failure, and he opposed the Corn Laws in 1815 quite publicly. So he is acting against the government and the government's actions. He was then invited to speak at Spa Fields meeting in November 1819. He proposed this idea of universal suffrage for the first time in a mass meeting. Now, he had proposed gaining universal suffrage through peaceful measures. He was then further invited to St. Peter's Field in 1819. He accepted the invitation, but then he was charged there for seditious conspiracy. So we can see Henry Hunt initially portrays quite a large threat towards the government because he has a large following. He's using speech, which means that his ideas can be accessed by everybody across the country instead of those who can just read and write. He created fear within the government. They feared he would gain a large following at St. Peter's Field, so they sent the yeomanry in to suppress the meeting and arrest him. He was also seen as the champion of the people. People liked him. They liked to hear what he had to say. He had good national popularity due to his advocacy of universal suffrage as well. However, like William Cobbett, he was also arrested for 2.5 years and was unable to become MP. So, in terms of his threat, he produced a threat because he had a large following. However, ultimately, the government were able to stop him by arresting him for 2.5 years. And he was unable to be successful in his bid as MP. So those are our radical individuals and the threat that they produced. We then move on to looking at the organisations and the extent to which they produced a threat for the government. So first we have the London Corresponding Society. Now, this was formed by Thomas Hardy in 1792 to spread political ideas through pamphlets and to the working class. It was inspired by the French Revolution. It promoted ideas of universal suffrage and annual parliaments. However, within the London Corresponding Society, there were some discrepancies. There were some individuals who wanted just broader social and political reform, and some who wanted universal suffrage. And Thomas Hardy didn't really want to take either side. He was worried that championing universal suffrage would then mean that the society lost support, so he was reluctant to champion these causes and instead just focused specifically on parliamentary reform. Now, as a society, they published pamphlets, which in their November issue, they set out their aims, their desires to use peaceful methods, petitions to Parliament, rather than organising mass demonstrations. So they put themselves forward as a peaceful organisation. He didn't put any limits on membership. He adopted this slogan, "Let our membership be unlimited." Therefore, it had a low fee so the working class could join too. The local associations were also small, so the bodies who were in discussion were small, and that was to allow for debate and to ensure that all voices could be heard. However, it was then infiltrated by the governmental spy system, because Pitt was worried that it would become radical, and it was reported back to be strictly within the law. However, despite it being reported, these individuals were then tried for treason, and went through quite a lengthy trial system, which then eventually led to the pitfall of the London Corresponding Society. We also saw this lead to the suspension of habeas corpus, which meant that it was now lawful to arrest people without viable evidence. So the idea of guilty with innocent without being proven guilty was essentially removed. We then have the Spa Fields meeting, which happened in November 1816. Now, this was organised by Thomas Spence. He was a self-taught radical. He was around in East London, and he wanted to lead a violent rioting and disorder. However, he invited Henry Hunt to address the crowd here, and they were asked to present the petition to the Prince of Regent to reform Parliament. Now here, there was a crowd of 10,000 people. This was the largest since the anti-Catholic Gordon riots in 1780. Hunt championed the moral force for reform, but did come close to suggesting the use of physical violence, where he said, if the Prince of Regent didn't meet us here, we may have to find alternative methods. The Prince of Regent didn't come, so they called a second meeting in December 1816. Now here, the Spenceans did not wait for Henry Hunt. He was due to speak again, but the Spenceans instead encouraged the crowd to take their own course of action and started rioting and looting. However, the governmental spy system was one step ahead, and they were aware of this meeting. So the Lord Mayor of London and his constables quickly dispersed the rioters and arrested their leaders. They were able to do this because of the spies and the use of agent provocateurs provided them with info into the radical activity. So again, this was brought to an end due to government intervention. We then have the Pentridge Rising. Now, the Pentridge Rising took place on the 9th of June 1817, and they wanted an insurrection, so a violent uprising against the government. They were led by this man called Jeremiah Brandreth. He wanted a violent uprising against the government. Initially, he was met by this man called Oliver, who was actually an agent provocateur. He convinced this group, led by Jeremiah Brandreth, to essentially prepare for uprising, because he convinced them that there were groups in London and across the country who were also preparing for an uprising. So on the 9th of June 1817, Jeremiah Brandreth led 300 men up towards Nottingham. Here the government, due to the work of Oliver, spies and agent provocateurs, were able to intercept the rebels using a regiment of soldiers, and 80 of these men were arrested. An article was then published after this detailing the role of Oliver by Edward Baines, who said that the government was at fault, not the government, not the radicals, sorry. So what this did is essentially painted the government in a negative light, because people were able to see that they actually initiated this. They led to the arrest of these 80 men, but the government did not stop there. What they did is they took these 14 men who were the ringleaders, they transported them, and Brandreth himself, the leader, was hung and beheaded in public, and that was to act as a deterrent to stop others from doing the same thing. We then have the Peterloo Massacre. Now this occurred on the 16th of August 1819. At this stage, radicalism had flourished, especially in Manchester and the north, due to the rise in the working class. There was an increase in campaigns, mass meetings in 1818 due to economic downturn, meetings aimed for parliamentary reform. Now the Peterloo Massacre, the march at Peterloo was led by this man called Samuel Bamford. Again, he was another radical leader. He organised groups to carefully show non-violent protests, and he wanted universal suffrage. So his aim was to gain suffrage through passive measures, and he'd organised groups in such a fashion that they when they attended St. Petersfield, they were there in almost military marches. So their organisation was to such an extent that they appeared to be drilling in the fashion that they were walking. Now, it was held at St. Petersfield in Manchester. They invited Henry Hunt to speak, and it attracted approximately 80,000 men, women and children from Manchester and its surrounding areas such as Oldham, Stockport, etc. The groups had banners which promoted universal suffrage, and Hunt arrived at 1 p.m. to address the crowd. The magistrates had already pre-issued a warrant for the arrest of Henry Hunt, and the reason they were able to do this is because they'd used their spy network to find out about the St. Petersfield march. They sent in the yeomanry, the Salford and Manchester yeomanry, to ride through the crowd and address Hunt. Now, when the yeomanry arrived, the people supposedly did not react. Okay, the people carried on marching. They did not respond with violence towards the yeomanry. However, when the crowds entered such a large, when the horses entered such a large crowd, they started to panic and tried to flee. Now, as the horses started to panic, the public also started to panic and tried to flee too. This led to quite large amounts of chaos. People were trying to flee, the horses got scared and started to trample on the people. The troops then started to attack the crowds as they felt that they were responding negatively with violence towards them, and it led to the death of 11 people and over 500 injuries. They did eventually get to Henry Hunt. He was arrested, but what this did is this painted the government in a really negative light. It led to quite a lot of backlash from the public against the government, and we saw this through the rise of sporadic rioting which followed on a national level against the government and in favour of universal suffrage. We also saw the growth of political unions after this in response to the Peterloo Massacre. So whilst ultimately the Peterloo Massacre was brought to an end due to government intervention, actually its aftermath suggests that it was of relevant threat towards the government, as it led to greater sporadic rioting and the growth of political unions fighting for universal suffrage. So, there are 4 ways in which the government intervened with the radicals. The first is through the suspension of habeas corpus, which was previously mentioned, and that was seen through the trial of the leaders of the London Corresponding Society. So, as Britain was at war with France in 1793, there was little sympathy for reformers at the time. The spies that infiltrated the London Corresponding Society were charged with high treason. Pitt at the same time suspended habeas corpus. So now it became possible for the police to arrest people without viable evidence and keep them for a lengthy amount of time. The London Corresponding Society had gained approximately 5,000 members, and the government were concerned about their growth, so they really wanted to spread quite a wide message across the country to try and eliminate their threat. And what they did is the government suggested that the London Corresponding Society were planning to assassinate George III. This, however, was not accepted by the jury. These trials were lengthy. They showed how seriously the government, especially Pitt, took the threat of domestic unrest and opposition towards the government. It showed that the government were willing to put substantial limits on personal freedoms in order to maintain stability. And because of this, most of the London Corresponding Society leaders withdrew from politics, despite not being charged. And Pitt then continued to harass any radical movements to try and make sure that they were brought to an end. We also saw the introduction of the Treason Act and the Seditious Meetings Act in 1795, so just a year later. And this came because there was a great amount of post-war unrest due to the poor harvest, the unemployment, poor trade, which were all at rife in 1795. Ministers decided to amend the treason law because of their failure in charging the London Corresponding Society leaders and due to the fear created by the post-war unrest. The Treason Act made it an offence to kill or even harm the king, and it then became defined as any intention to intimidate or even overawe the Houses of Commons or the Houses of Parliament. This was then accompanied by the Seditious Meetings Act, which restricted the size of public meetings to 50 people unless approved in advance by the magistrates. So what we have is this era of repression. The national crisis meant that the government would go above and beyond to eliminate radical threat. The Parliament used law to maintain constitutional activity. Radical activity rapidly diminished due to a more defined definition for treason and the Seditious Meetings Act. Patriotic feelings became higher due to the ongoing war with France, so again another reason for people not to support the radicals. And the leading radicals had been silenced or they had escaped abroad. We then have the introduction of the Gagging Act in 1817. So the war with France had just come to an end in 1815, and there was lots of opposition to Lord Liverpool's government at this time due to the ongoing poor economy, the poor harvest, and rising unemployment. And this became even more pertinent with the demobilisation of 300,000 troops. And the government did very little to alleviate these problems. So radical activity had increased between 1815 and 1817, and the government believed there was a broad national revolutionary conspiracy, and this was exacerbated by the existence of the Hampden Clubs and the Spa Fields meeting. So the Treason Act at this stage was due to lapse. But what the government did with the Gagging Acts in 1817 is made this Treason Act a permanent feature. Habeas corpus was also reintroduced, and it was suspended for all suspected acts of treason. And the Seditious Meetings Act of 1817 was passed once again. And what this stated is, as well as the 50 people limit, justices of the peace could now also attend any public meeting and disperse it if they saw fit. So this suspension of habeas corpus meant that ministers could prepare cases against radicals, and they could be taken out of circulation for several months without charge, essentially diminishing their influence. They succeeded in their aims of quelling short-term unrest, especially within London, and the terms lapsed in 1817, however, 1818, so radical activity could start up once again. So, that being said, the government needed to do something once again, and so they published the 6 Acts of 1819. And this came following Peterloo, where the government had seen well-organised threatening activity from the radicals, especially due to the discipline of the crowd. The government wanted to restore and maintain order, and so they published 6 acts, one of which was the Unlawful Drilling Act. The government believed that marches could be seen as training for future insurrections, so the act banned military-style drilling. They also introduced the Seizure Arms Act, which empowered the magistrates to enter any property where they thought arms were being kept. This then followed by the Misdemeanors Act, which reduced the ability of any arrest from being granted bail. The Seditious Meetings Act of 1819 said that public meetings were banned to 50, but could only happen at parish level. And then they also placed the Newspapers and Stamp Duties Act in 1819, which stated that a number of publications had to now pay stamp duty. This was extended, and the amount they had to pay was also increased. So anybody that broke the Unlawful Drilling Act was transported. The Seditious Meeting Act was also highly significant, as it meant that individual freedom was opposed, and it meant that ideas could only be kind of spread at a parish level. The stamp duty meant that a reduced number of newspapers and pamphlets could be published with profit. So anything that was published could only be read by the upper class. It shows that the government viewed radical activity as a threat to national stability because they had to put such strict measures in place. And actually it shows that the government had no effective means of control other than the laws to enforce stability, because they had very little weaponry. And part of that is because of the war with France, which has come to an end, and also due to the response to Peterloo, the government were reluctant to use weaponry and wanted to use laws to enforce stability instead. And essentially, personal freedoms at this stage were very, very limited. So overall, in terms of how big a threat the radicals actually posed, ultimately, the radicals were unsuccessful in achieving a large number of their goals. Universal suffrage was not achieved at the end of this. However, the government, you could argue, did see the radicals as a threat to some extent, as they put in all these laws to try and prevent radical activity from ruining national stability. So to an extent, the radicals were not a threat because they didn't achieve any of their goals. However, arguably, there was some level of threat seen by the government, which can be seen in their use of spies, in their use of laws, and the use of the yeomanry at Peterloo.